Sorry, someone called. So picking that up. Okay, in the war years, reality. In the war years, around 1942, the two new trends in filmmaking emerged. And it was a return. One was a return to the literature of the 19th century, or to the French school. In the war years, reality inevitably loomed large, and the screenwriters, directors, technicians, and actors who were there to be protagonists of the new realist cinema after 1948, 1945 were already working. Now we're going to talk about liberation and neorealism. With the film Open City Rome, shot in 1945, in a haphazard condition with economic and practical difficulties of all kinds, Italy returned to the forefront of world cinema. Shortly thereafter, the catch-all phrase neorealism became current. Okay? At the heart of the implicit ideology of neorealism lies the positive and generous desire for a profound renewal of people and society. Hence, some have suggested that its base values are humanistic and that it's therefore inaccurate to talk of Marxist or revolutionary hegemony behind the film. So they're talking about these political ideologies behind this type of filmmaking, this neo-realism. This neorealism is it's capturing communities as they are. Okay? And this is a new style of filmmaking in Italy. Okay. The most significant director in the neorealism movement was Roberto Rossellini, and his greatest films were Paesa and Germany Year Zero. There are neorealism films that still come out today, so don't think that there isn't. That style of filmmaking is not dead. It's not predominant as it was back in the day. So they're talking about now setting an endpoint to the development of neorealism cinema. And the writer-critic Franco Frattini in 1953 wrote this: the term is misconceived. The term neorealism is misconceived. And a better term would be neo-populism, since neorealism expressed a vision of reality founded on the primary of the popular, with its corollaries in regionalisms and dialect, and its components of Christian and revolutionary socialism, naturalism, positivism, positivistic realism, and humanitarianism. So they're talking about the core of neorealism and its revolution, because there's revolution amongst the people. So now you got this style of filmmaking that's capturing the reality, those realities, those subtle things that sort of make a community, which is the people, the culture. Okay? It's natural. And he calls it a naturalism. There are also external causes for the failure of neorealism. Okay, there's external causes now. In 1948, the electoral victory of the Christian Democrats provoked the final collapse of the fragile anti-fascist front, which had been one of the ideological sources of the movement. The deep division of the country into two hostile camps was reinforced by the nascent Cold War hostility between the two superpowers. The 1950s brought the transformation of Italy from an agrarian into an industrial nation, but also the accentuation of the economic and social imbalance between the North and the South. Okay? Christian Democrats, centrist politics used democratic legitimacy as an alibi rather than as a stimulus to civic responsibility. As a result, neorealism cinema was perceived as an art and culture of opposition more than it ever was in reality, and as such, it was targeted by the ruling class. The battle for and against it took a clear political, ideological features, rather than cultural or and artistic, and in turn, this made it more difficult for its practitioners to make constructive revisions and develop their style. So you have this neorealism style that now it's come under attack by Christian Democrats in Italy. So as a result of this, those filmmakers who were drawn to that type of filmmaking could not refine and advance that style anymore. Okay? So that was another factor to the decline of neorealism. Page 359 at the top, we're looking at what they're calling the easy years. In the 1950s, the easy years, as the iconic title of Zampa's 1953 film had it, for Italian cinema. In 1955, the first year of television in Italy, box office sales reached a peak of 819 million, never equaled before or since. The 25 films made in 1945 had already become 62 in 1946. So in 1945, they made 25 films. By 1946, they were making 62 films a year. By 1950, it was 104. The high point was in 1954, where they made 201, and so on. But there was still this avalanche, this flux of American films. And it was often they were older films, which flooded the market. The faction grew from 13% to the immediate post-war years to 34% at the end of the 1950s, reaching 36% in the 1954, and edging towards a peak of 50% at the end of the decade. Okay, I'm moving on to Britain at the end of the empire. There was a commercial exploitation of synchronized sound cinema, and it came about in Britain almost entirely with American technology. So Great Britain was not, they were dominated by British cinema was dominated by American technology. You had the Vitaphone wax disc, movie tone sounds on film. So the sound was really taking over. In Britain in the 1930s, with the German Tobis Company jostling for some of the action, this was yet one more sign of the American domination of British film. America had the largest home audience of any national film industry, so producers were able to cover production costs at home, making practically all earnings abroad into profits. American distributors thus had the flexibility to undercut their competitors in foreign markets, so they can bid their films for cheaper because they were making them abroad back at home for less, and they were able to flood the market with American films. So it made the popularity of American films made British exhibitors reluctant to book British-made films. And that further disabled the film industry in Great Britain. If you make a film and you can't exhibit it, then you've just wasted money, because no one's going to buy tickets to come see it, because you can't display it anywhere. You can't exhibit it. Okay, so this surge, or this interest in American films was still dominating Britain. Conservative government passed protectionist measurements as a result. In its Cinematic Films Act, so they made a Film Act of 1927, it intended to ban restrictive policies of block booking and blind bidding. The American studios would now have to pay for their dominance by financing the production of a quota of British films while also taking some back for exhibition to the United States. So studios now, American studios who wanted to do business in Britain, had to take some of their earnings and back British productions. The 1927 Act also created conditions for the British industry to emulate the American patterns for vertical integration. So they have they're now looking at the system, this Hollywood system, that vertical integration, and how Hollywood is able to make these films, so good films, so fast and effectively and economically. And now they're starting to emulate that. Cinema and cinema going in the 1930s. The arrival of talkies, sound, dramatically changed the audience experience of the cinema. The expanse conversion caused many independent-owned cinemas to go out of business, but the emergence of the combined ABC and Gaumont British, plus the general popularity of cinema, led to a cinema building boom, while ticket prices remained low. If the 1930s were a period of general increase in the standards of living, despite the slow down in industrial production, unemployment seems to have had little effect upon cinema admissions. Even among those who were most affected by it, audiences were, by all accounts, poor working class Britons, with young urban people and women being the most frequent attenders, and the female population's opinion were carefully monitored by exhibitors as a guide to profits. So you had the slowdown in the industry and unemployment, which was pretty high, but the cinemas were not affected. People were still going to the cinemas to watch the movies. It was this form of escape from their problems, and it still is. As the decade progressed, there was an expansion of cinema building and cinema going into the middle-class suburbs. They called these super cinemas, and they were constructed in the West End, in the suburbs of London and other major cities in Britain. And they often had cafes, dance halls, bars, orchestras, and it made the cinema a diversionary experience. Okay, meaning it would take them away from the problems of the day. Working class audiences generally preferred American-made films over British ones, which they found too posh, talking, and slower in pace. However, there were zones of widespread appeal of British filmmaking in the 1930s, linked to the possibilities offered by synchronized sound. In the United States, sound technology was invigorating old genres and creating new ones: the musical, the gangster film, the screwball comedy. In Britain, sound transformed featured film production in three areas: the suspense cinema, Alfred Hitchcock, all right, musical comedy, especially the popular films of Jesse Matthews, Grace Fields, blah, 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 and the epic film of empire or historical pageant. Okay, on page 365, the question of cinema's social impact and its role in class relations had become more urgent in the 1930s as the mass unemployed voice became louder, and as sound cinema itself brought the question of class to the forefront, given the intensity with which class was coded through spoken language. Okay, so we have, in Great Britain, they have different dialects. And these different dialects sort of varied based off class structures. So these different dialects were, like, if you spoke one way, it's like, oh, he's speaking this way, he's from this class. So now that you have sound, the sound is capturing these different dialogues and dialects of Great Britain. And they're discovering that it's like a codified way of distinguishing classes. Okay. Moving on to the Second World War. With the outbreak of war, scrutiny of the social role of cinema intensified. Recognizing the profound influence of film-going on psychological mood and opinion, Parliament issued official guidelines to studios advocating certain subject matters and forbidding others. Okay, so now this is the Second World War, and Great Britain they're realizing the power that film has on the psychology of the masses, this effect. So now they're like, okay, look, there's only going to be certain types of films made, okay? And films were submitted to the government through the Ministry of Information Films Division, and they had to be approved of the subject matter, the film, what the film was about, because they only wanted films that would portray Great Britain in a specific way. So what happened ultimately? There were ultimately only 9 studios were left in operation, and home feature production fell from 108 films in 1940 to an average of only 60 films until the end of the year. Others who benefit from the crisis were newsreels, right? Newsreel footage, as like the news, that little news, like news, a reel of news, global news, world news that they would play before a film. And documentaries. So those two genres benefited from this crisis. War produced an acute demand for coherent representations of the nation that showed its divisions of region, of class, of sex, of age, as underpinning the ultimate identity, character, and above all, unity of the country. So now the public has sort of seen this neorealism, and these new types of films, neorealism, the newsreel, the documentary, and so now there's a demand for this because these films are showing the underclass and the structures of underclass and class divisions. Okay. One of the loudest and most influential of many wartime voices calling for the new school of realist cinema in Britain had been that of Michael Balcon. He'd taken charge of a small Ealing studio in 1938 from Basildine, and although continuing to make more popular musical comedies that had been the studio's mainstream through the 30s, he wanted a cinema more in touch with the issues of contemporary British life in both appearance and story. So he's tapping into the pulse, the social pulse of the community, and wants to reflect that in his films. Okay? The end of the 1940s has seen a crisis in the British cinema, which had affected even the largest studios, and from which many never recovered. In 1947, the Labour government slapped a 75% Dalton tax on all earnings of Britain and foreign films, and it was intended to aid the ailing British economy. Hollywood responded with a 6-month boycott of the British market. Okay, so Hollywood was like, nah, forget that. We're going to boycott you. So the traditional values, of masculinity have been disturbed by the war. And these uncertainties, combined with the relaxation of the BBCF rulings, permitted the emergence of a realist cinema which tested out new versions of the male, paving the way for Britain's new wave and the cinema of the so-called angry young men. This gave way to a new life in British cinema, but not in all. For British cinema of angry women, we have to turn back to the early films of Gracie Fields. Okay, so there's looking at sexism divisions. You have angry men and then angry men and angry young men and then angry young women. And that's after the war. Okay, so now there's these concepts of masculinity and femininity being challenged by this art form. Okay, so I'm gonna end that now right there, and I will see you guys on the next video. All right.